you ever messed up? I mean, if you're more than 2 years old, the answer to that is probably yes. And the question then becomes, once you've messed up, now what? As we come to the story of Abraham, God included an example of Abraham messing up. But then he graciously gave us the what's next. As we come to Genesis 13, what we find is that Abram has just been kicked out of Egypt. And so tail between his legs, he comes out, a little bit embarrassed, no doubt. And yet, what we find is that when he goes back into the land, he doesn't sulk. He doesn't become, throw a pity party or become self-obsessed. What he does is he does what he needs to do. He gets back up and he begins following God and obeying God once again. As counterintuitive as it might seem, part of the life of faith is learning how to respond in faith to failures in faith. Okay, that might seem a little bit weird. Let me say that again. Part of a life of faith is learning how to respond in faith to failures of our faith. That would be great if we never failed. It would be great if every time we trusted God completely, totally, implicitly. It would be great if we understood like he did and never made any mistakes. But that's not going to happen. Abraham is the example of faith. The New Testament says, have faith like Abraham. And yet here we read that Abram didn't always have faith. Sometimes he made mistakes. But the key was that even when he messed up, he got back up. And he did what he was supposed to do. As we come to this lesson, this one's maybe a little bit longer than some of the others. And so one of the things that I think is helpful when studying something like this is to kind of get the broad overview of what's going on, because sometimes if you can get the big picture, that helps you put the details into place a little bit better. So as we come to this passage, what we see here is that, first of all, we're going to see what happens when Abram leaves Egypt, and that's in verses 1 through 4. And that's going to show us really Abram turning his heart back to the Lord. And then once he does, he's going to face another problem. And you may not have thought about it before, but the problem that he faces is in many ways similar to the original problem that he faced. It's a shortage of resources. There's not enough in the land to support both Abram and Lot. Okay, so the question is, did Abram learn anything? Because the last time there was a shortage of resources, he started solving the problem on his own, and it blew up in his face. Is he going to solve problems on his own, or is he going to trust God? And so that leads to the second big section where Abram and Lot separate. And we're going to see that see that breakdown as the strife between Abram and Lot. And we'll talk a little bit about that, kind of give some of that background. We're going to see Abram make a selfless choice and Lot make a selfish choice. And then we're going to round the account of chapter 13 out by looking at God's promise to bless Abram. And so God's going to promise to give the land. God's going to promise to give many descendants. Again, remember that Abrahamic covenant has those three key ideas: land, seed, and blessing. And we're going to be coming back to those repeatedly. Here in the end of chapter 13, God is going to reiterate that promise. I'm going to give you all of this land, Abram, and your seed you're going to have many seed, and the world is going to be blessed through them. So again, sometimes it's helpful to just survey the chapter and kind of skim through and see where things are going. So as you're preparing, read through the chapter, read through the kind of the outline, and then read through the biblical text, and then read through the lesson itself. So as we come to this, we see first of all Abram leaving Egypt. Now it's kind of interesting because Abram is actually blessed. Okay, so it says in verse 13, and Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold. Where did he get that? Well, some of that probably came from Egypt. Look at chapter 12 and verse 16. This is Pharaoh. It says, he treated Abram well for her sake, for the sake of Sarai, the sister of Abram, whom Pharaoh had taken. And he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maidservants and she-asses and camels. Now this is maybe a little bit perplexing for us. Abram shows a lack of faith, hurts other people, brings shame on the name of God, and yet he winds up richer through it all. And that, I think, is a warning to us because, and that's, again, one of the questions. I think it's worth thinking about this verse because it's kind of startling, again. And when you read carefully, verses like this should really stand out. Abram is leaving because of his disobedience. And yet as he leaves with great wealth. And I think one of the reasons that this is included is to be a warning to us. Don't think that because you're seeing material blessings that God is automatically pleased. And sometimes we want to make that connection, right? We want to kind of be the reverse of Job's friends. Job's friends said, everything bad is happening to you, therefore God is not happy with you. You must have sinned. And sometimes we'll flip that on its head. And sometimes we'll say, well, everything's going really well for me, must be God is pleased. And it's, I think, a sobering reminder to us that God can bless in spite of our disobedience. And that we need to be careful that we judge ourselves by the standard of God's word and not by what's going on in our lives. And as we continue to go, we're going to see next that Abram calls out to God. Okay, so that's there in verse number 4. And you can, again, begin with an observation question there. Look at the previous chapter and note the last time that God calls out to Abram. The last time that God calls out to Abram, it says in verse 8, and he removed from thence unto a mountain, this is chapter 12, verse 8, on the east side of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. You say, why is that important? Well, notice where he is in verse 3. It says, and he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. I think it's interesting to note that geographically, literally, Abram returns to where he began. But I think that scriptures, the Bible doesn't waste details, especially these Old Testament stories. If there's details, they're important. And I think that this geographic location is also communicating, what would you say, a metaphoric or a deeper meaning. And that is not only is Abram literally returning to the place, but figuratively he's returning to the place. He's going back to the beginning. Sometimes in our spiritual lives, we find ourselves needing to go back to where we started. And again, sometimes that's a literal place. Maybe there was a place where God did a work in your life and you found yourself drifting away, and sometimes it's good to just go back to that actual place and remember what God did in your life there and recommit yourself. That's what Abram is doing here. He goes back to the place where he was before this whole journey began, and he once again calls on the name of the Lord. And that takes humility. It does. It takes humility to go back to God after we've screwed things up, after we've messed things up, after we've just made an absolute mess, to come back to God and say, God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And to call out to his name once again. It takes eating some humble pie. And yet Abram does that. And as we're going to see, God blesses him as a result. So again, that leads us to our second example here, and that is that Abram and Lot separate. And as I mentioned in the introduction, what we find here is that Abram faces a very similar problem to what he did back in chapter 13 or back in chapter 12. In chapter 12, the problem was there's not enough resources to go around because there's a famine. Now the problem is that Abram and Lot have both gotten to be so large and so blessed by God that there's not enough room for the both of them. Not only that, we read, but the Canaanites and the Perizzites are also in the land. In verse 7 it says, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. So it's getting crowded. Abram and Lot are both sojourners. Canaanites and Perizzites are probably more what we would think of as the natives, like the actual inhabitants of the land. And so what are they going to do? Well, we see here Abram make a selfless offer. Now, Abram was the patriarch. He was the leader of the family. And so Abram had every right to pull rank and say, listen, Lot, things are too crowded. I want you to go over here. I'm going to go over here. And Abram had every right to make the choice. And in doing this, Abram is not only being kind, he's showing faith. What if Lot chooses the best portion? And he does. What if, and again, we don't think this way because we know how the story ends, and it ends pretty well for Abram, and it doesn't end quite so well for Lot. But Abram doesn't know that at this point. What if Abram gives Lot the better portion, and Lot goes and he continues to grow and expand in wealth, and Abram continues to maintain, or because he's not on his nice feeding grounds, maybe his flocks kind of diminish in size? What if Lot ends up being the more impressive, more important figure? What if Abram ends up playing second fiddle to his own nephew? But these issues don't shake Abram. He trusts God, and he trusts the promises, and he says, you know what? You decide. So Lot has to make a choice. And there's a few interesting details about Lot's choice. Things that it's worth pointing out. So in verse 10 we read this. It says, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. Throughout Scripture, we consistently see that when people are following their eyes, it's not good. In fact, the New Testament will remind us that we walk by faith and not by sight. In Scripture, often those who follow what looks good to them, as did, for example, Eve, it doesn't turn out well. Lot's only consideration here appears to be what he can see. The wickedness of the land is not considered. You say, well, did he know that? Well, there's a hint of that in verse 13. It says, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. It seems hard to imagine that Lot would have no idea. In fact, the very reality that detail is included seems to clue us in that Lot shouldn't be doing this, but it looks good. Now, this is kind of sad here, but the second point to point out is notice what else it says in that description. It says in verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord. Now notice these next few words, like the land of Egypt. Lot wants to get back to Egypt. Not literally. He got kicked out. He knows that. But he looks and he says, oh man, that looks just like Egypt. Abram's example of compromise, well, we're going to lie about my wife. We're going to go to this place where it's dangerous, but that's fine. We need water for the flocks. Abram was teaching that convenience and success comes before convictions. Well, this just works better, Abram thought. And so Lot picked up on that. He said, well, it's kind of sad, but when we look at this, it's almost as if Lot is asking himself, what would Abram do? What would my uncle do? Well, look, there's a good watered land. Yeah, but there's wicked sinners. Yeah, but I think it's going to be okay. And as we mentioned in verse 13, it lets us know that these men are wicked sinners. Lot saw the prosperity, but he didn't see the danger. There's a lot of people today who will do the same thing. They'll make decisions and they aren't on the lookout for spiritual danger. And so they make decisions and they're like, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Why? Well, because it's good for my career, or because it's going to help our family this way or that way, or, well, I want my kid to go to this school because they've got a really great engineering program. And I'm not saying that we have to completely bubble wrap our families and totally insulate them from the outside world, but we need to take seriously the reality of the dangers that are out there. And we need to do what we can to protect ourselves and our families from that danger. And Lot's not doing that. All he sees is the potential for success. To kind of put it in modern terms, he's got dollar signs in his eyes. And so Lot makes a wrong choice. And then we see finally in this that God promises to bless Abram. This is going to be verses 14 through 18. And God promises to give him the land. God has already told him that. But you could see why Abram might begin to wonder if that was the case. After all, he kind of blew it with that situation in Egypt. Now he's given the best part of the land over to his nephew. And Abram might be thinking, I wonder if it's over. I wonder what's going to happen now. We keep running out of resources. And so verse 14, the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Now that's interesting. That includes the place that Lot just looked at. Right? Lot looked over and said, oh, that looks good. I'm going to go over there, okay, Uncle Abraham? And Uncle Abraham said, okay. And after he left, God said, look around. Everything that you see, even that portion of land over there, that's going to be yours one day. And so God trusted Abram, or Abram trusted God to take care of him. And then God once again promises to give many descendants. He says, and I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. And so that seems to be, again, in direct contradiction of what Abram sees. Because Abram is 75 years old. We're told that at least 75. We're told that in Genesis 12, verse 4. Who knows how many years have gone by. But there's been a fair amount of time, and Abram and his very old wife have not had any children yet. And yet God keeps giving promises. And it doesn't look in the moment like those promises are going to be fulfilled. If God hadn't said anything and you asked Abram, what do you think the odds are your family ends up owning all of this and that you end up having a lot of kids? The answer would be, well, I don't have any children. And right now we're just a wandering foreigner. And yet God keeps making these promises. And so he once again gives a renewed command for Abram to go into the land. Verse 17, arise, walk through the land, in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. And so we see that Abram goes and he walks around in the land. And this is not just, okay, yeah, sure, we'll go and kind of do a survey trip. This is a trip of faith, really. God says, that's your land. You're going to own it. I'm going to give you children. Now go walk around in it. And Abram does. And as he does, these small steps of faith, calling out to God, offering Lot the first choice, traveling through the land, believing he will one day inherit it, are setting Abram up. They're building within him the reflex to say, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust God. And he's doing it in little areas. And those are, of course, preparing him for when he'll have to do it in bigger areas, for when he reaches the ultimate test, which we'll get to at the end of our series, and that of offering up his own son Isaac as an offering. Now, Abram messed up, but he got up. He returned to the Lord, and he kept living a life of faith. And in our lives, there's going to be times when we fail God, and the question is, what are we going to do when that happens? Satan's going to try and keep us from returning to God. Our own flesh is going to try and keep us from returning to God. And yet, with God's grace and God's help, we can come back and we can get back up. Now, this isn't to downplay sin or excuse sin and say, hey, if you sin, it doesn't matter. Just get up and God will be fine with it. There are consequences for Abram's trip to Egypt. We've seen at least one of those where it seems like he's, in some ways, perhaps, corrupted his nephew, who's now thinking in terms of, okay, where can I go to get some really, really good crops and some really, really good grazing ground for my flocks? And that seems to be the only consideration. This isn't the last time we're going to hear about Egypt and the impact that it has on Abram and his family. No, Abram will pay a price for the choice that he made, but God forgives him, and God continues to work with him, even despite his sin and its consequences. Your sin will have consequences. My sin will have consequences. Your unbelief will have consequences. My unbelief will have consequences. But sin doesn't have to have the last word. By God's grace, with his help, we can respond even to our mistakes in faith. And by God's grace and with his help, faith can be what has the last word in our lives.